Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have Dr. Jerry Root, and he is discussing C.S. Lewis and his screw tape letters. Dr. Jerry Root is probably one of the best C.S. Lewis scholars that we have today. And in this clip, I think he really gets into the secret to unlocking C.S. Lewis's Christian worldview. So let's go ahead and watch some of this clip, and then let me know if you are seeing or perceiving what I believe is the most important thing to understanding C.S. Lewis's Christian worldview. Let's go.
There's always new work to be done. And with the screw tape letters, Lewis is doing this kind of work. He's using this particular form that he can communicate ideas that we might see something from a unique angle, a new angle, and it invites us to see ourselves and our need for grace at that moment. Also, we can note that sometimes fiction works best to penetrate the heart in ways nonfiction cannot. George MacDonald, who was a Scottish author who deeply influenced Lewis, he said he never wrote a book where he didn't at least quote from MacDonald or quote an idea from MacDonald. He even did an anthology of George MacDonald's work. MacDonald said in his novel, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood, "We do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies." If you tell a child he has a soul, he thinks like anything else he has, his books, his keys, his coat. He could leave it behind someplace. He thinks when he dies, he goes to the grave and his soul goes off someplace else. But MacDonald says, tell him he is a soul and that when he dies, he goes to heaven and he leaves behind his body like clipped hair on the barbershop floor or old clothes that he's outworn. I don't know exactly what makes up the soul. I've read a lot of literature on it. I think you can prove the existence of the soul and so on. But traditionally, we would say the soul has a choosing part, the will, volition. It has a thinking part, the reason. And it has an emotional part, a feeling part. I would suggest to you, even coming from an academic world, that the reason is by far the weakest part of the soul, the reason. If I make a bad choice, my reason being weak does not kick in and say to my will, that's a stupid choice. You follow down that path, you're just going to hurt yourself and hurt others who care for you. No, instead, my reason being weak, it's marshaled by my will to make all kinds of excuses and rationalizations for that particular choice. We'll look at that in one of the themes that we look at in the letters, because Lewis is constantly talking about what he calls akrasia, the rationalizing of bad behavior. If I'm hurt emotionally, my reason doesn't kick in and say, boy, Jerry, you need to really grieve that particular thing. And you need to untether from that person who hurt you. And grieving, you must also forgive them so that you'll be set free. As Anne Lamott in her book, Traveling Mercies, says, bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. And so here's the emotion has to be processed, and the reason often prevents it from occurring. And so consequently, reason being weak as it is, Lewis says, will often stand sentry over my heart, preventing certain truths to get through, lest they challenge me that I have to change my will about some issues, or I have to grieve and forgive about some issues. But the reason has guarded and stands like dragon sentries over my heart. And Lewis says sometimes the story can get past the watchful dragons. The imaginative literature can get past the watchful dragons in a way some propositional literature cannot. The Bible affirms this, of course. We all know the passage where David has committed adultery with his good friend's wife, Uriah, and then he ends up engineering Uriah's murder. And Nathan the prophet is now told he has to go tell the king of his sin. I don't know about you, but I'd be a little bit nervous about that particular assignment. So what does Nathan do? He crafts a story. And he tells the story to the king. And the story gets through where the proposition or the mere prophetic pointed finger might not. And David is humbled by the story. Lewis understands this in the use of imaginative literature. But now let's consider again Screwtape Letters as a mere imagined source for spiritual guidance. Lewis, as a spiritual guide, said he was not a theologian. And what he meant by that was he wasn't a professional theologian. He didn't earn his living as a theologian. He didn't do some of the things that theologians do. But he certainly was well read on theological issues, and in some ways more well read, I think, than most theologians. I mentioned to you the book English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. It took him over a decade to write that book. He wrote it for the Oxford History of English Literature. He called it his Oh Hell volume, Oxford History English Literature, because it took so long. But it was the century of the Reformation. He's the only guy I know that read thoroughly both sides of the Reformation. It's significant. He knew his theology. He knew it better than most. But he was unquestionably a wise and spiritual guide because he not only knew theology, he knew the applications of theology to the struggles of the human heart. And consequently, he becomes a good spiritual director. Paul Ford took all the letters of Lewis and just put the ones that were pastoral advice into a single volume, and you can read through those, and they're tremendous. The Screwtape Letters are a mirror into our souls. They're like the pond in which Queen Orul of Glom discovered herself to be everything she hated. They're like the mirror in which Daimer, one of Lewis's best books is Daimer. It's a narrative poem. He wrote it before he was a Christian. And so many of the great themes that appear in Lewis appear in question form in that book, but we find Lewis finding answers in God in the later books. But nevertheless, Daimer discovers himself to be a coward by looking in a mirror. And then, of course, there's Eustace Clarence Scrubb. Do you remember him? Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. C.S. Lewis begins that book. That's written by Clive Staples Lewis, who knew nobody deserved to be named Clive Staples Lewis. Eustace is the archetypal brat. He has the heart of a dragon under the skin of a little boy. And in the magic of that land, in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he is actually turned into the very thing he was internally. He's trouble from the get-go on the Dawn Treader. They have processed through a horrible storm. The mast has been broken. They come aground. Eustace, rather than doing work with the others, goes off on this island. And on this island, he becomes a dragon. And looking in a dragon pond, he sees his dragon face and visage, and he realizes all of a sudden the truth about himself. And he weeps and weeps and weeps. It all comes home to him. He goes back to the crew of the Dawn Treader and his cousins, Lucy and Edmund, and he scratches awkwardly in the sand that he's Eustace, having been turned into a dragon. In his changed state, he's able to help them. He helps them revictual the ship. He knocks down a tree, and with his hot breath, he tempers the wood and puts it in place as the mast on the Dawn Treader. He helps them see where sweet water is on the island so they could fill up the cistern on the ship. And now they're going to be leaving the next day, and they don't know what to do with the Eustace problem. And it was that night where Eustace, back at the dragon pond and the dragon horde, is encountered by a lion. In recounting, he says, I was bigger than the lion, but I was so afraid of this lion. And the lion said, you must undress yourself. And all of a sudden, Eustace says, of course, dragons are scaly things like lizards and snakes. Maybe I could just shed my skin and be boy again. Tremendous effort. He tries. He sheds his skin and looks in the pond, and still he's boy. With tremendous effort, he sheds his skin again and looks in the pond, and still he's boy. A third time, frustrated, he does it, and still, he's dragon. Still he's dragon. And knowing he can't undragon himself, he looks to the lion, and the lion says to him, I must undress you. And taking that dragon claw, he goes all the way through that dragon flesh, all the way to the dragon heart, and gets past the watchful dragon, see? It makes him boy again. It's an act of grace for him to be restored. The look in the mirror, the honest assessment of self, is the first step towards the recovery that can be made by virtue of grace. And in a sort of backhanded way, as Screwtape reveals to us the truth of ourselves, he becomes a sort of John the Baptist who prepares us for the coming of Christ. Note, this is not Screwtape's intention, and yet it's done nonetheless due to Lewis's craftsmanship of the literary form and his use of Screwtape as a kind of comedic character, albeit a very nefarious one. Satan's plans always play into the sovereign purposes of God at the end of the day. And the book ends appropriately with the tempter experiencing great frustration. And this is as it should be. Lewis reminds his readers in a preface to Paradise Lost, God shows his benevolence in creating good natures, but he shows his justice in exploiting evil wills. Whoever tries to rebel against God produces a result opposite to his intention. And Lewis is exploiting the wiles of Satan, even by using this particular literary form, that we might grow in grace as we encounter what Lewis has to say to us on its pages. In her book, All New People, Anne Lamott tells a story, and in the story, the context is a discussion of the nature of grace. And the mother of the story asks, what sound does a one-hand clap make? And the answer, of course, is it doesn't make any sound unless it hits another hand. It's mentioned in the book that there's a Japanese proverb, what sound does rain make? And the answer is, it doesn't make any sound until it hits something, an umbrella, a hat, a puddle. And the context is, what sound does grace make? And the answer, of course, grace doesn't make any sound unless it hits something. A deep-seated insecurity and fear, an estranged relationship, a broken heart. And as Lewis holds up to us the mirror of scorn and pity in these letters, he brings us to the place where we're ready to be recipients of grace and allow grace to touch us in those very places that have been revealed to us. Lewis's Screwtape letters are painted across the larger canvas of Lewis's ideas of hell. And without some background in this regard, one will not make as much of the letters as he might. And this will be the topic of our next lecture.
All right, there is just so much to say here, but as you can see, C.S. Lewis is a master of story, and he is a master of example. What I want you to be thinking about is this. C.S. Lewis is the only apologist that has been able to appeal to the sin nature. Now think of this term apologist, defending the Christian faith. C.S. Lewis is really the only one that is getting to the core human problem, the fall of human nature. He does this in the moral argument, for example, and he wants us to reflect upon the fact that we have broken the law. He talks about the law of human nature, and he doesn't mean, or he talks about the law of nature, and what he means by that law of nature is he means human nature, and he knows that we know that we have broken it. Now, if you go all the way back, it's really this issue, and I think this is the secret, the key to unlocking lots of C.S. Lewis's worldview, is that we're not just a soul. I mean, we are a soul. We're not just a mere rational mind, meaning you really have to deal with the emotional, psychological level of who you are. And he actually makes a pretty strong argument that our emotions are stronger than our reason, because we realize with our reason and predicated upon our emotions that we go against what we know is right all along. It's as if we use our minds to do things we know that we shouldn't do, which means that there is something that is overcoming us. We have a sin nature that overcomes our emotions and therefore our reason. And again, he says this in his moral argument. You just go read the Mere Christianity, the part where he actually talks about this. What's interesting, though, as I was thinking, is this also correlates to the Apostle Paul. It's not as if C.S. Lewis just creates this out of thin air. If you go and look at Romans 1 has us looking at the world and looking at the Gentile world in this example and saying they do all of these things. They have a debased mind. They've been given up by God to their sinful desires, to their passions, and this has caused a just judgment by God. And then in Romans 2, which I think is often missed because human nature is prone to look at other people and not reflect on the self, Paul basically says, now look at yourself. Everything you see in the world, in that Romans 1 world that I've just described, is a mirror effect. And you saw that in this clip, looking in the mirror. It's a mirror effect. And this is my way of thinking about Romans 2. I like to talk about it as a mirror effect. Everything you see in the world is a direct reflection of who and what you do. Do you see it? That is what God is trying to get you to see. He's trying to get you to see that everything you see that's wrong in the world is really just a mirror of your own soul. And there's no person that has been able to reflect on that better than C.S. Lewis. He truly is the best at reflecting upon the fallen human nature, using the human nature, the internal knowledge that we all have to reveal to us our sin. But this is the thing, to get us to grace. Now, this lecture was on the screw tape letters, which is kind of like that diabolical playing devil's advocate look at the world. And I think the reason why this work of C.S. Lewis is so important is that it gets us to really reflect on the insidious nature of not only what's going on in the world, but ultimately what's going on in our souls in relation to what is bad in the world. C.S. Lewis, nobody quite like him. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Remember that Christianity is Christ, and without Christ, there is no Christianity. See you in the next one. Peace.